Clark calling out Stephanie White for her defensive game plan and the stupid mistakes and things she keeps going back to after seeing they don't work.
There are moments in professional sports when everything that has been building quietly beneath the surface, all the tension, all the disagreement, all the frustration that locker rooms and coaching staffs work so hard to keep invisible, finally breaks through in a single unguarded moment that nobody can walk back. What happened in that Indiana Fever press conference was one of those moments. Caitlin Clark walked to the podium after one of the most personally devastating losses of her professional season, a game that should have been a celebration, a milestone, a commercial triumph, and instead of delivering the standard athlete-approved nothing answer designed to protect everyone in the building, she did something that sent shockwaves through every corner of the WNBA world. She told the truth, not vaguely, not diplomatically. Not with the careful, well-managed language that professional athletes spend entire careers perfecting precisely, so that moments like this never become the story. She told the specific, technical, basketball-literate truth about exactly what had broken down, exactly when it had broken down, exactly what the mechanism of failure was, and exactly why it was not happening for the first time. And the woman responsible for the system she had just publicly dismantled was standing just outside that same room, waiting for her turn at the microphone. What happened next is the moment this entire...
And we kind of went back to our old ways where that second rotation we didn't get, and then they scored off the 90 cuts and the 45 cuts.
Entire season's tension stopped being something fans had to infer from rotation statistics and shot charts, and finally became something the entire basketball world could see clearly with its own eyes. To understand the full weight of what happened in that press conference, you first have to understand the specific context surrounding the game that produced it. This was not just another regular season loss on an ordinary Tuesday night. This was Caitlin Clark's sneaker debut day, a commercially significant milestone that had been planned, marketed, and anticipated for months. The cameras were there specifically to document a celebration. The reporters were there to cover what should have been a cultural moment. This was the kind of day that gets circled on a marketing calendar well in advance and generates coverage that extends far beyond the sports section. Instead, those cameras...
You see that? We went right back to the old defense where nobody's rotating. We're playing one-on-one. There's no help. There's no rotations.
Documented something entirely different. Clark went into the fourth quarter with 26 points and 7 assists. She was playing at a level that should have been the story of the day, a brilliant individual performance on the day her signature shoe made its public debut. Then the fourth quarter happened, and when the final buzzer sounded, the stat line read exactly the same. 26 points, 7 assists, not because Clark had stopped producing, because she had fouled out of her own milestone game. The question that demands an honest answer is a simple one. Why was Caitlin Clark in foul trouble in the first? The answer is not complicated, and it is not particularly flattering to the coaching staff responsible for the system she was operating inside. Teams have understood for the better part of this season that the Indiana Fever's defensive structure creates specific vulnerabilities, and that those vulnerabilities leave Clark exposed in exactly the situations that produce cheap, game-altering fouls. Opponents have been hunting those situations deliberately, targeting Clark specifically, knowing that when Indiana's help rotation fails to materialize, the defensive burden falls harder on individual players in positions they should never have to defend alone. On the single most commercially important day of Clark's...
So we know the Indiana Fever took a disgusting loss to the Atlanta Dream in Caitlin Clark's sneaker debut day in a game where she was absolutely going off 26 and 7 going into the fourth quarter, and then she finishes the game with 26 and 7 due to foul trouble.
That exact vulnerability was exploited at the exact worst moment. She fouled out. The loss was finalized. The cameras that were supposed to document a commercial milestone instead captured the visual record of an organizational failure playing out in real time. Clark knew what had happened. She had watched it unfold from the inside of the system, in real time, for the third time against 3 different opponents. And when the post-game press conference arrived, she made a choice that changed everything. Let's be completely precise about this, because the precision of Clark's language is exactly what makes this moment so significant. She did not say the team needed to be better. She did not gesture vaguely at collective struggles. She did not deploy any of the dozens of professionally acceptable nothing phrases that athletes use every single day to avoid saying anything that might create friction with a coaching staff or generate uncomfortable headlines. She said, "We kind of went back to our old ways where that second rotation we didn't get, and then they scored off the 90 cuts and the 45 cuts." Parse that sentence carefully, because every single part of it is doing something specific. We kind of went back to our old ways. That phrase alone is a direct, explicit acknowledgement that this is not a new problem. Clark is saying that the team had previously identified this approach as a failure, had presumably moved away from it, and then returned to it anyway. Old ways is not a neutral phrase. It is Clark drawing a clear line between a defensive philosophy that had already been tried and found wanting, and a decision to return to that philosophy regardless. That second rotation we didn't get. This is the technical heart of the critique. In defensive,
A lot of times, like, that's probably on us guards, getting into the ball a little bit better so we don't have to rotate, but I think we could have done a little bit better. Like,
basketball, the second rotation is what separates a system that can contain ball movement from one that collapses against teams that can swing the ball and attack the gaps that open up when the first defender overcommits. Clark is identifying the specific moment in the defensive sequence where Indiana's system breaks down. The moment when the first rotation occurs, but the second rotation, the one that closes the lane that the first rotation opened, never arrives. They scored off the 90 cuts and the 45 cuts. For anyone who needed confirmation that Clark was delivering a basketball-literate technical breakdown rather than an emotional post-game reaction, this is it. She is naming the specific cutting patterns that exploited the gap created by Indiana's failure to complete the defensive rotation.
Kelsey said, like, essentially everybody on their team shot over 50%. It's really hard to win a basketball game when that's the case.
Sequence. This is the vocabulary of someone who understands defensive basketball at an advanced level and is identifying with precision the exact mechanism by which the system failed. This is not a frustrated player venting. This is a sophisticated basketball analyst delivering a post-game breakdown of a coaching failure, from the inside, on camera, on the record, after a loss. The fact that it came from the team's own franchise player rather than an opposing coach or an outside analyst does not make it less accurate. It makes it more alarming. Clark did not stop there. She referenced teammate Kelsey Mitchell independently arriving at the same conclusion about the same defensive collapse, noting that essentially everybody on the Atlanta Dream's roster had shot over 50% from the field. That detail is critical. When the entire opposing roster shoots above 50% in a single game, that outcome does not emerge from bad luck or unfortunate shooting variance. It emerges from a defensive system that is structurally failing to contest shots, structurally failing to rotate, and structurally failing to make any opponent uncomfortable on any possession across 40 minutes of basketball. Two different players, same conclusion, same press conference, same documented failure. And then Stephanie White walked to the podium. Sources present in that press room describe White's demeanor in terms that are hard to misread. Visibly different from her standard post-game composure. Not the careful, message-disciplined version of herself that she typically brings to that environment. Something that looked, by multiple independent accounts, like a head coach who had just had her defensive philosophy publicly dismantled by her own franchise player, and was not managing that reality with any particular grace in front of the cameras. What White reportedly did at that podium was precisely what the entire season's pattern predicted she would do. She did not address Clark's specific critique. She did not acknowledge the rotation breakdown that Clark had just named with technical precision. She did not engage with the observation that two of her own players had independently identified the same systemic failure in the same press conference minutes earlier. She returned to the same talking points: individual defensive responsibility, guard your matchup, one-on-one containment, that her franchise player had just identified, specifically and on the
one-on-one D. That was pretty much the story of when we had our defensive failings. It was our one-on-one D. We tried to wait until they caught the ball to defend. We didn't make it difficult for
Our one-on-one defense. Why are we playing one-on-one the whole time? Now, I get it on straight line blow-bys. I understand that. But
the record as the actual source of the problem. To understand why this disconnect is so significant, you have to understand the philosophical divide it represents. Stephanie White's public coaching philosophy, the one she has consistently emphasized throughout this season in her own press conference appearances, centers on individual defensive responsibility. The core principle is straightforward. Guard your own assignment, win your one-on-one matchup, trust individual defenders to contain their own player without relying on help rotation that takes defenders away from their own assignments and creates new vulnerabilities elsewhere on the floor. Clark is describing the exact opposite conclusion from the same defensive results. She is saying that the one-on-one approach is not a philosophy that can succeed against perimeter-oriented teams with the athleticism and ball movement to exploit the gaps that a no-help system inevitably creates. She is saying that rotations are not optional refinements to an otherwise sound system. They are the mechanism that prevents opponents from scoring freely every time Indiana's individual defenders get beaten off the dribble or exploited by a well-timed cut. Two people, same locker room, same defensive film, same statistical results, arriving at completely opposite conclusions about what those results mean and what needs to change.
You had plays where people are putting the ball on the floor, dribble, and nobody is stepping over to help at any point in time. Why would you go back to this when you saw this did not work?
Them to pass the ball around the perimeter, and they're fast. When they catch it on the run and attack our feet, we're already behind.
That is not a minor disagreement about rotation timing or defensive positioning. That is a fundamental philosophical collision about how professional basketball defense should actually be played. And it had been building under the surface for an entire season before Clark finally said it explicitly, with specificity, on camera, after a loss on her sneaker debut day, with every reporter in Indianapolis present to document it. Here is the detail that should concern anyone evaluating this situation with genuine objectivity rather than simply picking a side. Clark's post-game comments were not a reaction to a single bad defensive performance. They were the latest entry in a documented, season-long pattern of the same defensive failure producing the same results against different opponents, with Clark publicly identifying the same mechanism of failure after each instance. She referenced it directly, the same defensive approach that had already failed against Golden State, the same defensive approach that had already failed against Portland, and then the same defensive approach deployed again against Atlanta.
Why would you go back to this when you saw this did not work?
Them to pass the ball around the perimeter, and they're fast. When they catch it on the run and attack our feet, we're already behind.
This lady has got to go. This lady has got to go. And furthermore, Caitlin Clark has got to take the bull by the horns, and you gotta make a decision. This is courtesy of Sports Illustrated, and Caitlin Clark's brand is obviously taking a hit for this. Obviously, there's been some huge smear.
Producing the same results for the third documented time on the single most commercially significant day of Clark's season. Think about what that pattern actually means from a coaching evaluation standpoint. A system fails. The franchise player identifies publicly the specific mechanism of failure. The coaching staff returns to the same system. It fails again in the same fashion against a different opponent. The franchise player identifies the same mechanism publicly a second time. The coaching staff returns to the same system a third time. It fails in the same fashion against a third different opponent. At some point, that pattern stops being defensible as coaching philosophy or competitive stubbornness, or a principled commitment to a system that simply needs more time and better execution. At some point, that pattern begins to look like an inability or an unwillingness to incorporate evidence that is being delivered, clearly and repeatedly, by the most qualified observer available, a player who is living inside the system in real time and identifying its failure points with technical precision from the inside. Clark has been right about this pattern across Golden State, Portland, and Atlanta. 3 separate documented instances of the same defensive failure, with Clark correctly identifying the specific
campaign going on. Everybody's flipping sides. We see what's going on out here. Caitlin Clark and her brand are being attacked in this moment. We've seen the all-star voting. I think there's some shady stuff going on. It's funny business going on surrounding Caitlin Clark right now. And I think the smear campaign is still alive, well, and kicking. That's what I think. But take a look at this here. Courtesy of Sports Illustrated. Caitlin Clark falling way behind in the WNBA MVP prediction market. Okay. Here it says the fever coming down on Caitlin Clark, and so the fever is coming down on Caitlin Clark.
Mechanism each time. The coaching staff has had 3 separate opportunities to acknowledge the pattern and adjust accordingly. It has not taken any of them. That is the organizational reality sitting underneath what looked on the surface like a single contentious press conference exchange. What makes this situation more urgent than a standard coaching disagreement is the specific context in which it is playing out. Caitlin Clark is not simply the Indiana Fever's best basketball player. She is the most commercially significant player this league has produced in a generation, possibly ever. Her arrival transformed the Fever's business model, drove attendance records across the league, elevated broadcast numbers, and created a commercial ecosystem around Indiana basketball that simply did not exist before she arrived. The sneaker deal, whose debut day this press conference interrupted, is just one visible piece of a commercial relationship with Clark that represents the central revenue story of this franchise. That commercial significance is being directly damaged by the same defensive system that Clark spent her press conference critiquing. Consider the MVP conversation. Clark is producing numbers that belong in an MVP discussion by any objective statistical measure.
So are her MVP chances. On prediction markets show a negative trend in Clark's MVP chances over the last month, despite her strong play. Clark is putting up MVP caliber numbers to start the season at 20 points, 8 assists, 4 rebounds. Her scoring and assists total ranked top 5 in the WNBA. The real slide stems from A'ja Wilson's scorching start. Okay, here it says, Wilson holding Clark back. While many view Clark's numbers as MVP worthy, Wilson is simply outplaying her and averaging 26 points, 9 rebounds, 3 assists, 2 blocks, and a steal and a half. That's all while leading Las Vegas to the second best record.
20 points per game, 8 assists per game, 4 rebounds per game. Production that ranks in the top 5 across the entire WNBA in multiple categories. These are the numbers of a player deserving serious individual award consideration. And yet Clark is sliding in the MVP conversation, not because her production has declined, but because the Indiana Fever are sitting in 7th place with a record that MVP voters weight heavily when making their evaluations. The gap between Clark's individual statistical production and Indiana's team record is not a talent gap. It is not a Clark performance problem. It is a direct, measurable consequence of a defensive system that has now failed in documented repeated fashion against multiple opponents, costing winnable games that drag down the team record that MVP consideration depends on. A'ja Wilson is having a historically elite season, averaging 26 points, 9 rebounds, 3 assists, 2 blocks, and a steal per game while leading Las Vegas to one of the best records in the league. That is a legitimate MVP case built on elite individual production combined with elite team success. Clark's individual production is genuinely comparable, but without the team record to support it, the comparison falls short in the eyes of voters who correctly factor winning into their assessment. Every loss that traces back to the defensive breakdowns Clark has publicly and repeatedly identified is a loss that damages her own individual award candidacy through no fault of her own production. Stephanie White's refusal to adjust the defensive system is not just costing Indiana wins. It is actively costing Caitlin Clark
League MVP voters weigh team records heavily. This hurts Clark, especially against Wilson, as Indiana is in 7th place at 9-6. And now they're talking about other people. They're talking about Paige Beckers is a threat to win MVP. Here it says, Dallas Wings second-year guard Beckers holds the advantage despite sitting behind Clark in scoring, assists, and rebounds. Beckers is the main reason Dallas turned it around after a 10-34 finish last season. Okay, and then people are talking about Olivia Miles being in the MVP race.
MVP consideration that her individual statistical production has clearly earned. And it is doing so in a season when Clark's commercial brand was supposed to be ascending to its highest visibility yet. The sneaker debut day that became a fouled-out defensive disaster is the most concentrated single-day example of that dynamic, but it is not an isolated incident. It is the accumulation of an entire season's worth of winnable games lost to a defensive philosophy that the team's own franchise player has been publicly critiquing since the season began. The Indiana Fever front office is now facing a question that has been building toward inevitability since the first time Clark publicly identified this defensive pattern, and that question has become impossible to ignore after what happened in that press room. When your franchise player, the most statistically productive guard in the league, the player whose commercial value underwrites your organization's entire current financial trajectory, stands at a podium and explains in specific technical detail exactly why your defense keeps failing. And your head coach responds by defending the same system anyway while visibly frustrated about having to address the criticism publicly. You have to ask yourself a direct organizational question. Who in this building has a clearer understanding of what this team needs to do to win basketball games? The evidence available to answer that question is not ambiguous. Clark
There's so much going on. And the percentages right now, they got Asia Wilson, Paige Beckers, and Caitlin Clark. I think you probably have to have Olivia Miles over Paige Beckers at this point. And this is what I mean, man. Stephanie White is getting in the way, and she's messing up the Caitlin Clark brand, man. Caitlin Clark was supposed to go on an MVP run this year, but instead we got Stephanie White over here messing it up, going back to the same defense that did not work, that teams exploited. We went back to the same defense we played versus the Golden State Valkyries, pretty much. Same defense stuff we went to versus the Portland Fire.
has correctly identified the mechanism of Indiana's defensive failure across 3 separate documented instances against 3 different opponents. Her technical analysis of the rotation breakdown, of the cutting patterns being exploited, of the gap between the team's defensive philosophy and the reality of what modern perimeter-oriented offenses do to a no-help system, has been validated by the results each time. The coaching staff has had 3 opportunities to adjust based on that evidence. It has not taken any of them. And the visible frustration on display at that podium when White addressed the media after Clark's comments is not the reaction of a coach who heard a legitimate critique and is processing it thoughtfully. It is the reaction of a coach who heard a public challenge to her authority and is responding defensively to the personal dimension of the confrontation rather than engaging honestly with the
Caitlin Clark falling way behind in the WNBA MVP prediction market. Caitlin Clark, and so are her MVP chances. On prediction markets show a negative trend in Clark's MVP chances over the last month.
substance of what was said. That distinction matters enormously for what the front office has to decide. A coach who disagrees with her players' tactical assessment, but engages with it openly, and explains her reasoning in good faith, even if the disagreement persists, is a coach managing philosophical tension in a professionally sustainable way. A coach who responds to specific technical critique with visible frustration, a defense of the same failed system, and no apparent acknowledgement of the evidence her own players keep providing. That is a different situation entirely. The front office has to determine which version of this they are actually dealing with. And the behavior documented in that press room, combined with the 3-game pattern of repeated failure without adjustment that preceded it, is pointing increasingly clearly in one direction. It would be easy, and wrong, to frame Clark's press conference comments simply as a player publicly undermining her coach. That framing misses the substance of what actually happened, and who actually bears responsibility for the situation that produced it. Clark did not go to that podium looking for a conflict. She went to that podium after watching the same defensive system fail in the same fashion for the 3rd time against 3 different opponents on the worst possible day for that failure to occur. And she gave an honest answer to a question about what happened, using the technical language of someone who genuinely understands the game at an advanced level and has been living inside the specific failure point she described for the duration of an entire season. The fact that her honest answer contained an implicit critique of her coaching staff's defensive philosophy is not Clark's fault. It is the natural consequence of asking an intelligent, basketball-literate professional athlete to describe a documented, recurring, preventable failure in real time after watching it happen again. The alternative, ask
Clark's numbers is MVP worthy. Wilson is simply outplaying her and averaging 26 points, 9 rebounds, 3 assists, 2 blocks and a steal and a half. That's all while leading Las Vegas to the 2nd best record in the league. MVP voters weigh team records heavily. This hurts Clark, especially against Wilson, as Indiana is in 7th place at 9-6.
Asking Clark to pretend that a pattern she has now observed 3 times is somehow mysterious or unpredictable would require her to be dishonest on camera in front of every reporter in Indianapolis. Clark chose honesty. She chose technical specificity. She chose to describe what she actually saw and what she actually believes needs to change. Those are not the choices of a player trying to create problems. They are the choices of a competitor who has watched a preventable pattern repeat itself one too many times and is no longer willing to protect a system she believes is wrong at the expense of her team's actual chance to win. The coaching staff's response to that honesty, visible frustration, a defense of the same failed philosophy, and no apparent willingness to engage with the substance of the critique, is what makes this situation genuinely alarming rather than simply an uncomfortable moment that gets smoothed over in the next film session. Here is the honest assessment of where this situation is heading if nothing changes. The Indiana Fever cannot afford to let this fracture deepen. This is not a franchise with enough roster depth, enough organizational stability, or enough margin for error to absorb a sustained breakdown in the relationship between its franchise player and its head coach. The entire competitive and commercial foundation of this organization rests on Clark's continued investment in Indiana's success. A player who feels unheard, whose on-court feedback is being repeatedly dismissed, whose specific technical critiques are being met with defensive frustration rather than genuine engagement, is a player who eventually starts doing the math about where her future is best spent. Nobody is suggesting Clark is actively considering leaving. That would be premature and unsupported by available evidence. But the conditions that lead talented players to quietly disengage, to stop investing fully in an organizational project they no longer believe is being managed competently, those conditions are being created game by game, loss by loss, and now press conference by press conference. Stephanie White may be a fine coach in many respects. She may have genuine strengths that are not visible in this particular story. But the specific documented pattern under examination here, a defensive philosophy that has now failed repeatedly against multiple opponents, combined with an apparent unwillingness to adjust in response to evidence from the player best positioned to evaluate its effectiveness from the inside. That pattern represents a coaching problem that is real, measurable, and consequential. The Indiana Fever front office has to decide whether it is going to address that problem directly, which means honest organizational conversations about whether the defensive philosophy needs to change, and whether White is capable of making that change, or whether it is going to allow the pattern to continue until the gap between Clark's individual brilliance and the team's disappointing record becomes the defining story of a season that had so much more potential. Caitlin Clark stood at a podium on the day her signature shoe debuted, after fouling out of a game she had been dominating, and told the truth about exactly what is broken inside the Indiana Fever's defensive system. That truth was specific. It was technical. It was delivered on camera, on the record, with the precision of someone who has been watching the same failure repeat itself across an entire season, and has reached the point where protecting a coaching staff from honest accountability is no longer something she is willing to do. Stephanie White walked to that same podium minutes later, visibly frustrated, and defended the exact philosophy her franchise player had just publicly identified as the source of the problem. Two people, same organization. Fundamentally incompatible understandings of what this team needs to do to win basketball games, and an entire season's worth of documented evidence supporting one of those understandings over the other. The press conference was not the problem. It was the symptom. The problem is a defensive system that keeps failing, a coaching staff that keeps returning to it anyway, and a franchise player who has now said publicly, 3 separate times, in increasingly specific and technically precise language, exactly why it keeps costing Indiana games it should be winning. The question for the Indiana Fever front office is not whether something needs to change. The evidence on that question is overwhelming. The question is whether they are going to make that change before the cost of not making it becomes something this franchise cannot recover from. Drop your comment below. Does Stephanie White finally adjust this defense after Clark's most direct public call-out yet? Or does this pattern continue until the Fever front office is forced to make a decision that changes everything about the direction of this franchise?